The U.S. Army tried to destroy the one rifle modification that could stop Japanese scouts. At 4:47 a.m. on Bougainville, 9 Japanese scouts were already moving through the grass, close enough to map American defenses before sunrise. They believed they were safe. At that distance, Americans weren't supposed to hit anything. Private First Class Raymond Vandermeer watched from a muddy foxhole, knowing exactly how this usually ended. A single shot, a body on the ground, and no enemy in sight. His issued rifle lay beside him. Legal, approved, useless. In his hands was something else. An ugly wooden platform bolted onto his Springfield. A modification the Army had banned 3 weeks earlier and ordered destroyed. If officers found it, he'd face court-martial. If he didn't use it, his friends wouldn't survive the morning. Within the next 48 hours, 9 scouts would be dead. Not because of a new weapon, but because one soldier decided survival mattered more than the rulebook. Vandermeer didn't grow up learning how to kill. He grew up learning how to not waste a shot. Outside Sioux City, Iowa, his family worked a small farm that never quite paid what it promised. 200 acres of corn and soybeans, enough to keep you busy, never enough to make you comfortable. When the weather cooperated, they survived. When it didn't, they tightened belts and kept going. That balance shattered when Raymond was 12. His father collapsed in the north field one afternoon, face down between the rows. A heart attack. No warning, no second chance. By the time Raymond's older brother found him, the man who kept the farm running was already gone. The farm didn't stop because someone died. It just demanded more hands. Raymond's mother took on the books. His sisters helped where they could. And Raymond, still a boy, became responsible for the things that couldn't wait. Fences, engines, pests, especially pests. Groundhogs were a constant problem. They tore up fields from below, collapsed rows, ruined crops slowly and invisibly. Traps didn't work. Poison killed livestock. Shooting was the only answer. But ammunition wasn't free. Raymond's grandfather understood that better than anyone. A Dutch immigrant who'd homesteaded the land decades earlier, he believed in tools that earned their keep. If something didn't work, you didn't complain about it, you changed it. Years earlier, he'd taken an old rifle and built something strange onto it. Not a scope, not a fancy sight, just a crude wooden extension fixed forward of the stock. It wasn't meant to look good. It was meant to stay still. The idea was simple. When you're shooting from a field, you rarely have a clean, prone position. But you always have something: hay bales, fence rails, wagon sides. The wooden platform let the rifle rest flat, distributing weight, killing wobble. Raymond learned on that rifle. Not fast shooting, not dramatic shooting. Slow, deliberate shots, because every miss meant wasted money. By 14, he could hit groundhogs farther than most adults cared to try. By 16, he understood wind without knowing the math behind it. He wasn't strong. He wasn't popular. He wasn't quick with words. But when the rifle settled, the front sight stopped dancing. That mattered. When the draft notice came in late 1942, nobody in Sioux City was surprised. Raymond didn't argue it. He packed what he was told to pack and left the farm behind with no speeches and no illusions. By the spring of 1943, he was in the Pacific. The jungle was nothing like Iowa. Fields had horizons. The jungle swallowed them. Distance meant nothing when leaves hid everything. Heat soaked into gear. Moisture ruined wood and rusted steel. Nothing stayed clean. Nothing stayed dry. And the enemy didn't fight the way the manuals said they would. Japanese scouts didn't charge positions. They didn't trade fire. They observed. 2 or 3 men at a time, moving slowly, memorizing where Americans slept, cooked, talked, relaxed. Then, when the moment was right, a single shot, 1 man down, no target, no response. Raymond saw it happen in his first weeks. A man carrying ammunition forward collapsed without a sound. Another was hit while shaving, the razor still in his hand. Someone else walked past a hidden position and was shot in the back before he could turn. The rifle fire always came from farther than expected. American infantry doctrine leaned on speed and volume. Suppressive fire. Movement. Closing distance. It worked when you could see the enemy, but scouts didn't want to be seen. They wanted Americans nervous, cautious, slow. Raymond watched Medic's bag, personal effects, wallets, letters, photographs, and began to recognize the pattern. Not courage, not marksmanship, stability. The scouts fired from positions where they could wait, where their rifles didn't wobble, where the first shot mattered. When Raymond was issued a Springfield as a designated marksman, he felt the familiar disappointment immediately. The rifle itself was accurate enough. The problem was everything around it: the stance, the footing, the constant motion of a body trying to stay upright in mud. He remembered his grandfather's rifle, not the wood, not the shape, but the idea behind it. You don't beat distance with bravery. You beat it by staying still. The first time since arriving in the Pacific, Raymond realized the Army wasn't losing the long-range fight because it lacked weapons. It was losing because it lacked something much simpler: a way to hold the rifle steady, no matter where the ground gave up on you. Japanese scouts weren't there to win firefights. They were there to make firefights unnecessary. They moved before dawn and after sunset, when shadows were unreliable and depth meant nothing. They didn't carry extra gear. They didn't talk. They didn't rush. Their job wasn't to kill Americans in large numbers. It was to decide where Americans could be killed later. A scout team would crawl forward, memorize the perimeter, count foxholes, listen for generators, note where cooking fires appeared. Then they would disappear quietly, patiently back into jungle that swallowed footprints within minutes. And sometimes, before leaving, they would fire a single shot, not to start a battle, to prove a point. The shot always came from farther than expected, far enough that return fire meant nothing, far enough that squads fired into leaves and vines while the scout was already moving away. That distance mattered. American infantry doctrine assumed contact would be obvious. Suppress, maneuver, overwhelm. It worked in open terrain. It worked against visible enemies. It failed against men who didn't want to be seen. The jungle turned every assumption upside down. In the Solomons, American patrols began to move slower. Men stopped standing upright. Conversations dropped to whispers. Meals were rushed. Everyone learned the same lesson at the same time. You could be dead before you knew you were under attack. Raymond watched it happen across multiple units. One morning, a soldier carrying boxes of ammunition toward the line stiffened and collapsed as if someone had pulled a string. The bullet had passed clean through his chest. No muzzle flash, no sound beyond the crack. The scout had been watching the trail for hours. Another time, a corporal stepped out of his foxhole to shave. He'd barely raised the razor when the shot hit him through the temple. The razor fell first. The body followed. The scout responsible was never found. These weren't accidents. They were patterns. Japanese scouts didn't need to kill many men. They only needed to own distance. Once Americans believed they were vulnerable anywhere beyond 100 yards, hesitation did the rest. Commanders tried to respond with what they understood. On paper, American infantry rifles were superior. Semi-automatic fire, higher rate of fire, reliable manufacturing. Compared to Japanese bolt actions, the numbers looked decisive. Reality didn't care. Rapid fire was meaningless when the enemy fired once and vanished. Volume of fire couldn't suppress a target you couldn't locate. Closing distance only worked if the enemy stayed still long enough to be closed on. They didn't. Reports began to pile up. Patrols stalled. Casualties mounted in small, demoralizing increments. The solution, when it came, felt logical to officers sitting behind maps and radios. Designated marksmen. Old bolt-action Springfields were pulled from storage and issued one per platoon. In theory, a trained shot with a more accurate rifle could counter the scouts at range. In practice, the jungle ruined the theory. The Springfield's iron sights were adequate on a range. In the field, under canopy, with fog and glare and movement, they were barely enough. More importantly, the rifle assumed stable footing. The jungle provided none. Marksmen fired from kneeling positions that wobbled. Standing shots shook. Prone positions were soaked, uneven, or blocked by roots and rocks. Every shot required fighting the ground as much as the target. Raymond watched men try and fail. They saw movement. They fired. They missed. The scout fired once and left. The doctrine emphasized bravery. Push forward. Be aggressive. Return fire. Close in, but aggression doesn't shorten distance when the enemy controls when and where contact happens. The scouts had time. They waited for Americans to relax, to stand up, to turn their heads. They fired when the body was exposed and still. Raymond understood something many others hadn't articulated yet. The problem wasn't marksmanship. It wasn't courage. It was geometry. The scout fired from a position where his rifle didn't move, where his body was supported, where distance favored patience. American rifles, in contrast, were fired from positions that demanded constant correction. Every breath moved the sight. Every muscle tremor mattered. The army wasn't better trained. They were better set up. Losses continued. A soldier eating breakfast collapsed before his mess kit hit the ground. Another was hit while walking past a camouflaged pit so well hidden that men stepped within feet of it without seeing anything. By the time a position was found, it was empty. Raymond began to feel the quiet anger that comes before action. Not panic, not fear. A grinding awareness that the system was failing the men using it. He held the Springfield again, testing its balance, feeling how it shifted with every adjustment of his body. He imagined trying to hold it steady while breathing, while sweating, while balancing in mud. And he remembered his grandfather's rifle, not the wood, the principle. The scouts weren't winning because they were braver. They were winning because their rifles stayed still. Raymond realized that no amount of training would fix that. No speech, no manual, no diagram. The army had tried to solve a physical problem with doctrine. And until someone solved the physical problem, until someone figured out how to keep a rifle steady in terrain that refused to cooperate, the scouts would keep choosing the distance. They would keep deciding who died first. Raymond didn't know yet how he was going to change that. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. As long as American rifles wobbled in the jungle, the scouts would keep winning. His answer arrived wrapped in confidence. Designated marksmen. Boxes were opened. Old rifles came out of storage. Springfields, bolt-action, long-barreled, accurate on paper, were issued 1 per platoon. The logic was clean and comforting. If scouts were killing at range, give someone a rifle meant for range. Raymond was handed one and felt the weight settle into his hands. The Springfield M1903 was not a bad rifle. It had history. It had precision. It had won competitions and wars. But wars aren't fought on paper. The first time he tried to use it the way the manual suggested, the jungle answered immediately. Kneeling shots wobbled as mud shifted under his boots. Standing shots amplified every breath. Going prone meant lying in water, roots pressing into ribs. The rifle never quite resting the same way twice. The sight picture refused to behave. Iron sights that were crisp on a range dissolved into uncertainty under canopy. Light filtered through leaves at odd angles. Targets weren't silhouettes. They were fragments, an elbow, a shoulder, a shadow that might move. Raymond fired when he thought he saw something. He watched the foliage absorb the shot. Moments later, the scout fired once and disappeared. The problem repeated itself across the line. Marksmen tried harder. They steadied their breathing. They slowed their trigger pulls. They waited longer. It didn't change the outcome. The scout fired from a position he had prepared. The American fired from a position he had inherited. Preparation beat reaction every time. Commanders blamed nerves. They blamed inexperience. They blamed fear. Raymond blamed the ground. He started paying attention to where shots came from. Not the direction, the setup. Scouts fired from places where their bodies were supported. Against trees, from pits, from slopes where weight could settle. They weren't standing. They weren't balancing. Their rifles didn't wander. American marksmen, by contrast, fought their own bodies as much as the enemy. Every position required constant correction. Even a perfect trigger pull couldn't overcome a sight that refused to stay put. The Springfield hadn't failed because it lacked accuracy. It failed because accuracy alone wasn't the bottleneck. Stability was. Raymond tried improvising within the rules. He braced the rifle against sandbags. He rested it on logs. He shifted positions until his knees burned and his back screamed. The results improved slightly, never enough. Then another man died. This time it was close. Too close. A scout fired from farther than expected, caught a soldier mid-task, and vanished before anyone could respond. The medics moved with practiced speed. The body was covered. Personal effects were gathered. Raymond stood there holding the Springfield and felt the quiet rage sharpen. The rifle wasn't wrong. The doctrine wasn't stupid. They were incomplete. The Army had solved what to issue. It hadn't solved how the rifle would actually be used in terrain that refused to cooperate. Raymond remembered something from Iowa, not a memory of a shot, but of stillness. His grandfather hadn't trusted his body to stay steady. He had trusted wood and weight and support. The rifle didn't float. It rested. It stayed. That was the difference. Not a better bullet. Not a faster action. A platform. The realization didn't come with fireworks. It arrived quietly, fully formed. The way solutions do when they've been waiting for permission you never needed to ask for. The Army wanted marksmen to hit at range, but it had given them rifles without giving them a way to hold those rifles steady. Raymond looked down at the Springfield again, not as a weapon, but as a system. Barrel, stock, sights, all fine. What was missing was forward support, something that would let the rifle settle on whatever the jungle offered instead of fighting it. A rest you could carry. A platform that didn't care about mud, roots, or uneven ground. He knew how to build it. The knowledge wasn't theoretical. It wasn't new. It had been with him since childhood, shaped by necessity and sharpened by frugality. The only question left wasn't if it would work. It was whether he was willing to cross the line the Army had drawn and accept whatever came after. Because if he was right, the Springfield didn't need to be replaced. It needed to be changed. And the Army had already made its position clear on changes. Didn't start building right away. He spent the rest of that day watching how men moved when they thought no one was looking, how they shifted their weight, how they leaned rifles against sandbags, how every position introduced a different kind of wobble. The jungle didn't give you clean geometry. It gave you compromise. That night, alone in his foxhole, Raymond replayed his grandfather's method in his head. Not the measurements, not the shape, the principle. The rifle had to rest forward. The weight had to leave the shooter's body. You couldn't fight distance with muscle. You had to let gravity do the work. The challenge wasn't the idea. It was building it without being noticed. Army regulations were clear. Weapons stayed in issued configuration. Any modification, even well-intentioned, was destruction of government property. Confiscation. Punishment. Possibly worse. Raymond understood that. He also understood what he'd seen men die for. He decided to build at night. The first problem was material. He needed wood stiff enough not to flex, light enough not to throw the rifle off balance. The jungle didn't offer lumber. The supply area did. After evening chow, Raymond walked through the dump where empty crates stacked up like discarded furniture. Nobody asked questions. Soldiers scavenged constantly extra boards for foxholes, seats, makeshift shelves. He found a plank of rough pine, splintered and ugly, about the right width. He didn't measure. He judged by hand, the way farmers do. He carried it back like it was nothing. The second problem was support. A flat board bolted forward wouldn't survive recoil without reinforcement. It needed struts rigid, narrow, light. Wood wouldn't work. Too thick, too fragile. Metal was better. Raymond waited until late. When generators hummed low and the camp settled into tired quiet, he walked toward the motor pool. Damaged equipment sat everywhere, trucks, missing parts, crates of components no longer assigned to anything that still moved. Mechanics worked by habit, not curiosity. Raymond spotted 2 short sections of aluminum tubing and a pile of scrap. Aircraft grade, light, strong. He didn't sneak. He didn't rush. He picked them up, nodded once to a sergeant arguing with a clipboard, and walked away. The jungle rewarded confidence. Back in his foxhole, Raymond laid everything out. The plank, the tubing, his trench knife, a length of wire scavenged from discarded communication cable, and a small flashlight he kept dimmed with tape. He didn't have a saw. He didn't have a drill. He had time. He shaped the wood slowly, shaving instead of cutting, keeping noise to a minimum. Pine splintered under the knife, biting his fingers when he rushed. He learned to slow down. The shape didn't matter. Flat mattered, stable mattered. By midnight, the platform was roughly formed, ugly, uneven, functional, Attaching it was harder. The struts had to connect to the rifle without damaging critical components. Raymond studied the Springfield by touch, feeling where pressure could be applied without bending the barrel or interfering with the sights. He settled on the barrel band and front assembly areas already designed to carry stress. But without a drill, there was no clean way to make mounting holes. Raymond stared at the problem until it stopped being frustrating and started being obvious. He needed heat. He pulled a small can of sterno from his gear, lit it, and held a nail over the flame until it glowed faintly red. Then, gripping it with pliers, he pressed it into the wood. The nail hissed. Smoke curled. The smell of burned pine filled the foxhole. He pulled the nail out, reheated it, and pushed again. It was slow, painfully slow. Each hole took minutes. His fingers blistered where heat transferred through metal. Soot blackened his hands. He worked by feel more than sight. The flashlight tucked under his chin. Beam pointed away from anything reflective. When the holes were done, he threaded wire through the struts and cinched them tight against the rifle. The platform extended forward from the fore end, supported by the aluminum like a crude shelf. It looked wrong, too long, too agricultural, like something built in a barn with leftover parts. Raymond stared at it for a long time. If anyone saw this during inspection, there would be no explaining it away. He attached the rifle and rested it across a sandbag. The difference was immediate. The front sight stopped drifting. The rifle settled instead of floating. Raymond didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He breathed. The next morning, he waited. He didn't fire right away. He didn't want attention. He watched the perimeter, counted minutes, waited for a quiet pocket where sound wouldn't carry far. When he finally tested it, he picked a tree stump at distance farther than he'd trust with a standard setup. He settled the platform on a log. He let the weight sink. The sight picture held. He fired. The shot cracked and echoed, sharper than he expected. He worked the bolt slowly, feeling the mechanism seat. He fired again. Then a third time? When he walked out later to inspect the stump, the marks clustered tighter than he'd ever managed in jungle conditions. Not perfect, but repeatable. That mattered more. Raymond returned to his foxhole with the rifle wrapped in a poncho, heart beating harder now, not from fear of failure, but from the awareness of what he'd done. He'd crossed the line. The modification wasn't clever. It wasn't elegant. It violated regulations in obvious, undeniable ways. And it worked. That night, another man died to a scout. The shot came from distance. The scout vanished. The patrol returned with nothing but questions. Raymond sat with the rifle across his knees and felt the choice solidify. This wasn't an experiment anymore. It was a responsibility. If the Army wanted standard rifles, it would get them during inspections. If the jungle wanted something else, Raymond would answer that demand when it mattered. He didn't tell anyone. Not yet. He kept the platform hidden during daylight, removed it when officers were near, reattached it when the perimeter settled into night watch. Each time he mounted it, the motion became faster, more confident. The platform stopped feeling illegal. It started feeling necessary. Raymond knew what came next. Either the modification would prove itself, or he would pay for building it. But for the first time since arriving in the Pacific, he felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Control. The rifle no longer fought him. The ground no longer dictated his limits. Whatever happened next, it would happen on terms the jungle hadn't chosen for him. And soon, he would find out whether the Army's rules or the enemy's scouts were about to lose their advantage. The rifle worked. That much was no longer in doubt. What Raymond didn't know, what kept him awake at night, was whether using it would cost him more than it saved. For 2 days, he kept the platform hidden, removed it during daylight, reattached it quietly when the perimeter settled into darkness. He watched. He waited. He told himself he was being careful. Then the jungle made the decision for him. The scout fired just after dawn. Raymond wasn't looking in that direction when it happened. None of them were. The shot came from far enough away that no one flinched until the body fell. Private Leo Fisher had been eating breakfast. One moment he was crouched with a mess tin in his hands. The next, he was on his back, eyes open, steam rising from food scattered in the dirt. The bullet entered below his ear and exited cleanly. He never made a sound. Raymond was less than 20 feet away. He watched medics rush in, watched them press hands against a wound that couldn't be closed, watched the moment when effort turned into procedure. The body was covered. The mess tin was set aside like it mattered. Later, Fisher's wallet, letters, and photographs were placed into a small canvas bag. Someone tied it shut. Raymond stood there, holding a rifle he knew could have reached the position the scout fired from. He knew because he'd tested it, because he'd seen the sight settle, because the problem wasn't distance anymore. It was permission. The scout had fired from beyond where American rifles were supposed to be effective. That assumption was now false, and everyone on the line was paying for believing it. Raymond went back to his foxhole and sat with the Springfield across his knees. The platform lay beside him, detached, wrapped in cloth like contraband. Army regulations didn't feel abstract anymore. They felt personal. If he attached the platform and someone noticed, the consequences were clear. Confiscation, charges, court-martial, a quick end to his war that wouldn't look heroic on paper. But if he didn't use it, the consequences were clearer. More bodies, more canvas bags, more letters never answered. That night, Raymond stopped pretending this was an experiment. He attached the platform and left it there. No hiding it. No removing it for inspections. No pretending it was temporary. If anyone asked, he would tell the truth. He had built it because the rifle couldn't stay still, because men were dying at distances that shouldn't have been safe anymore, because doing nothing was its own kind of decision. He didn't ask permission from his sergeant. He didn't explain it to anyone else. He took first watch. The jungle didn't care about his reasoning. It waited. Fog settled in, low and thick before dawn, clinging to grass and filling the space between trees until distance became suggestion rather than fact. The same conditions scouts preferred. The same conditions that had cost Fisher his life. Raymond rested the rifle across the sandbag and let the weight settle forward onto the platform. For the first time, he wasn't wondering if he could hit at range. He was wondering when he would need to. Somewhere beyond the fog, men were moving, measuring, counting, deciding. Raymond watched the grass for disturbances and kept his breathing slow. Whatever happened next, there would be no pretending. By sunrise, either the Army's rules would be proven right, or the jungle would be forced to learn that something had changed. The fog began to lift at exactly the wrong speed, too slow to give clear sight, too fast to hide movement. Raymond watched the kunai grass through the thinning gray. His world narrowed to a shallow arc of ground he'd already memorized. The rifle rested forward on the wooden platform. Weight settled, balance no longer a negotiation. He felt ready in a way that didn't feel emotional, just mechanical. At first, it was nothing. A ripple, a bend in grass that wind couldn't explain. Raymond didn't move. Scouts never announced themselves. They revealed patterns. He waited for the second disturbance, the confirmation that separated animals from men. It came 30 seconds later. Then another. 9 shapes resolved slowly as the fog thinned low, spread out, deliberate. They weren't rushing. They were counting, measuring distances, marking positions they'd return to later. They were farther out than American rifles were supposed to matter. Raymond counted them twice. 9. He glanced at his watch without lifting his head. He had a window, minutes, not seconds. If they reached a certain rise in the terrain, they'd see the full perimeter. He didn't call out. He didn't signal. Noise was the one advantage he didn't need. The platform held the rifle steady as he shifted the slightest amount, aligning the front sight with the nearest scout's chest. The man was moving slowly, exposed just long enough to be careless. Raymond exhaled and squeezed. The Springfield cracked, sharp and flat. The scout dropped straight down. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The others froze, not diving, not scattering, just stopping. Confusion always came before panic. At that distance, they didn't believe what they'd seen. Raymond worked the bolt smoothly and settled again. Second shot, another body fell. Now the illusion shattered. The remaining scouts dropped flat into the grass, crawling backward, trying to disappear into the terrain that had protected them so many times before. But crawling didn't make them invisible. It made them predictable. Raymond tracked movement instead of targets, dark shapes against pale fog, elbows pushing grass aside, legs extending and retracting in rhythm. He fired again. The third scout jerked and stopped moving. 3 down. The fog continued to lift. Visibility improved just enough to turn chaos into clarity. The The scouts realized they weren't being harassed. They were being engaged by someone who could reach them. A fourth scout broke from cover and sprinted toward the tree line. Raymond didn't rush. Running targets were faster but also louder, more obvious. He led the shot slightly, accounting for movement the way he'd learned on open fields back home. He fired. The scout stumbled and collapsed hard, momentum carrying him forward before gravity took over. 4 down. Now the remaining scouts reacted with discipline. 2 of them opened fire toward Raymond's position, rounds cracking into sandbags, dirt jumping inches from his foxhole. They weren't trying to hit him. They were trying to force him down while the others withdrew. Raymond ducked, waited 3 seconds, not longer, and rose again. The platform steadied the rifle as if it were anchored to the ground. A 5th scout was moving right to left at roughly the same distance, trying to stay low while retreating. Raymond tracked him, led the shot, and fired. The scout went down screaming, hit in the leg. Raymond chambered another round and aimed again. He didn't fire immediately. The scout began to crawl. Raymond fired a second time. The movement stopped. 5 down. The scouts had lost stealth. They'd lost surprise. Now they were trying to survive. The remaining 4 pulled back faster, abandoning spacing, bunching up as they reached uneven ground. Raymond tracked the closest target and fired, and missed. The shot went wide, pulled left by a rush trigger. The miss mattered, not tactically, but mentally. It reminded him that this wasn't a demonstration. It was a fight. The platform didn't make him perfect. It made him capable. Raymond slowed down. He worked the bolt deliberately, let the sight settle again, and fired. The 6th scout collapsed forward into the grass. 6 down. The last 3 reached the edge of heavier vegetation, branches and vines beginning to break up their outlines. They were almost safe. Almost. And fired twice more, aiming for gaps, firing at movement rather than certainty. He couldn't confirm hits. The jungle swallowed them. Then it was over. The entire engagement had lasted less than 8 minutes. Raymond stayed in position, rifle up, scanning for return fire that didn't come. His hands shook not with fear, but with the delayed release of tension. Behind him, voices rose as other soldiers emerged from their foxholes, alerted by the shooting. Confusion followed noise, the way it always did. A sergeant reached him first, breathless, eyes wide. "What the hell just happened?" "We have..." Raymond didn't look back. He kept watching the grass. "Japanese scouts," he said. 9 of them. "You work. How many did you get?" "Well, they're fine." 6 confirmed. "Maybe more." "We forent." The sergeant stared at him. "At what range?" "Matagdu." Raymond finally turned his head. "Started at about 180. Finished closer to 160. Said. The sergeant shook his head. "That's not possible." "Diz," Raymond pointed. As the fog lifted fully, bodies became visible, dark shapes, lying where they'd fallen, spaced across open ground no one believed Americans could control. The sergeant stopped talking. Word spread quickly. Men came to Raymond's foxhole, careful not to crowd it, staring at the ground, at the bodies, at the rifle. They counted. They measured distances with steps. Someone finally noticed the wooden platform extending forward from the Springfield. "What is that?" a corporal asked. Raymond didn't embellish. "It's a rest," he said. "Keeps the rifle steady." "Wow. 100 den. 100 dens nus. That's not standard issue." "What are 5? "No. I." There was a pause. Then the corporal looked back at the bodies. "Can you make another one?" "That sacks." By noon, Raymond had 7 requests. By evening, he had more than a dozen. The change was immediate and impossible to ignore. The next time scouts approached the perimeter, they didn't get close. A marksman using one of the platforms dropped 2 men at nearly 200 yards before they reached observation range. Another patrol tried probing a different sector and lost 3 men in minutes. By the end of the week, scouts stopped approaching Raymond's section entirely. They went elsewhere. That was the real victory. The platform didn't just kill scouts. It forced them to change behavior. The jungle didn't feel safer, but it felt different. Raymond watched men sleep longer, stand straighter, talk louder. For the first time since arriving in the Pacific, Americans weren't reacting to scouts. The scouts were reacting to them. Raymond knew what that meant. Success attracted attention, and attention never arrived alone. But as he sat in his foxhole that night, cleaning the rifle by touch, he also knew something else. Whatever came next, inspection, punishment, consequences. The long-range fight had shifted. The scouts no longer owned distance, and the army was about to notice why. The rifle didn't stay Raymond's for long. By the afternoon, men were stopping by his foxhole one at a time, not in groups, not loudly. Soldiers understood instinctively when something worked and when it was better not to advertise it. They didn't ask for explanations. They asked for copies. What's it made of? How long does it take? Can you show me how to mount it without wrecking the rifle? Raymond answered simply. He didn't teach theory. He showed results. The problem wasn't skill. It was supply. Raymond's original platform had been built from scavenged luck. One good plank, 2 clean pieces of tubing, wire he'd found when he needed it. Building 1 was possible. Building 10 was something else entirely. That's where Corporal Henderson stepped in. Every company had one man like him, the soldier who knew where things came from after they disappeared from official lists. Henderson didn't ask questions either. He just nodded once and started moving. Within 48 hours, he'd collected scrap lumber, bent tubing, odd lengths of wire, pieces of metal that had once belonged to something important and now belonged to no one at all. Raymond worked at night, always at night. He set up in a supply tent with a kerosene lamp and a flashlight taped down to keep the beam tight. Each platform took longer than the first, 90 minutes if nothing went wrong, longer if the wood split or the wire snapped. There was no standardization. No 2 platforms looked exactly alike. They didn't need to. By the end of the week, more than 20 rifles in Company K wore some version of the same ugly shelf. Each one violated regulations in its own unique way. The effect was immediate. When scouts approached the perimeter again, they didn't linger. A man using one of the modified Springfields dropped a scout before he reached observation range. Another patrol lost 2 men in less than a minute and withdrew entirely. Word spread not through reports, but through behavior. Scouts stopped probing Company K's sector. They didn't announce the change. They didn't test it loudly. They simply went elsewhere. Other units noticed. Men from neighboring companies began asking questions. Quiet ones, specific ones. They wanted to know what Company K had that they didn't. Raymond built more platforms. By late November, modified Springfields appeared across the battalion. Then the regiment. No paperwork followed them. No approvals. Just whispered instructions and late-night work. Japanese reaction came just as quietly. Captured notes and translated fragments began to mention unexpected American accuracy at extended range. Scouts were instructed to stay farther back. Reconnaissance distances increased. The jungle adjusted, and so did the Americans. Casualties dropped not to 0, but enough to notice. Enough that men slept better. Enough that sentries relaxed their shoulders. Enough that the constant sense of waiting to be shot eased. Raymond didn't celebrate. He watched the spread with a farmer's understanding of success. When a solution works, it doesn't stay contained. It moves on its own. But he also knew something else. Nothing spreads through an army without eventually being noticed by the wrong people. Regulations hadn't changed. Inspections hadn't stopped. And every one of those rifles, every single one, was evidence of unauthorized modification. The scouts had been pushed back. Now another enemy was moving forward. One that didn't crawl through grass or fire from shadows. One that wore clean uniforms, carried clipboards, and believed deeply that order mattered more than outcome. Raymond kept building anyway. Because the jungle didn't care what came next. And neither, anymore, did he. The Japanese noticed the change before the Americans tried to explain it. They didn't need statistics. They read the ground. Scouts who returned alive talked quietly about what they'd seen, men dropping at distances that had always been safe, patrols losing stealth before they could even settle into observation. At first, commanders assumed coincidence. A lucky marksman. An isolated incident. Then the reports stacked up. Reconnaissance teams began reporting contact earlier than expected. Shots came from beyond the range American infantry had previously demonstrated. Withdrawal routes were compromised. Casualties were rising in places that had once been low risk. The jungle was teaching a new lesson. Captured documents later told the story plainly. Notes scribbled in the margins of reports. Adjustments written without ceremony. Enemy marksmen demonstrate unexpected effectiveness at extended range. Scouts were ordered to increase standoff distance. Observation points were pushed back. Teams that once crawled to within 150 yards now stopped 200 yards out or more. Not because doctrine demanded it, because fear did. A captured diary from a Japanese non-commissioned officer put it more simply. Americans shoot differently now. We cannot get close. That single sentence mattered more than any kill count. The platforms hadn't just improved accuracy. They had broken an assumption. For months, Japanese scouts had owned the long-range fight. Distance was safety. Patience was protection. They chose when contact happened. Now distance worked against them. Staying farther back meant less information, less clarity, less confidence. The very purpose of scouting getting close without being seen was compromised. Scouts lingered less. They moved faster. They took fewer risks. Those changes rippled outward. American patrols noticed fewer probes. Perimeters felt quieter, not safe, but less harassed. Men stopped flinching at every snapped twig. The constant pressure eased just enough to feel real. Morale shifted in ways no report could fully capture. It wasn't bravado. It was posture. Men stood differently when they believed the ground in front of them belonged to them again. They spoke louder. They slept longer between watches. They trusted the perimeter. The jungle hadn't changed, but the balance within it had. Raymond saw the effect without needing confirmation. Scouts no longer tested his sector. They slid around it, avoiding the invisible line where distance stopped being protection. That avoidance was proof. The platform had done what weapons were supposed to do in war. It forced the enemy to adapt on your terms. But adaptation cuts both ways. Raymond knew what followed success in an army. It wasn't praise. It wasn't curiosity. It was inspection. Somewhere up the chain, someone would notice that one regiment's casualties looked different. That scouting patterns had shifted. That unofficial solutions were shaping official outcomes. And when that happened, the jungle would no longer be the most dangerous thing Raymond faced. The enemy had adjusted. Now it was the army's turn. This never stays invisible for long. It arrives quietly at first, numbers that don't match expectations, patrol reports that feel off, a sector that's suddenly too calm. Somewhere above Company K, someone noticed the pattern, and patterns demand explanations. The inspection came without warning. Captain Thornton arrived mid-morning with 2 assistants and a clipboard held like a weapon. His uniform was clean in a way that felt intentional. He walked the line methodically, stopping at foxholes, lifting rifles, checking serial numbers. When he reached the first modified Springfield, he froze. He turned the rifle over once, then again. The wooden platform jutted forward, impossible to miss. "What is this?" he asked. No one answered. He didn't need them to. Unauthorized modification of government property was printed clearly in the manual. Thornton didn't argue tactics. He didn't ask about results. He quoted regulations like scripture. "These rifles are out of compliance," he said. "They will be confiscated immediately." Sergeant Miller tried to speak. He explained the drop in scout activity, the improved accuracy, the lives saved. Thornton cut him off with a raised hand. "Regulations exist for a reason," he said. "Order is what keeps men alive." Raymond stood a few steps back, silent. He knew the moment would come. He just hadn't expected it to feel so final. By noon, modified rifles were stacked near a fire pit. Platforms were removed and thrown onto the pile, wood cracking, aluminum bending, wire snapping under boots. Thornton watched them burn. "This ends today," he said. "Any soldier found with an altered rifle after 1,800 hours will face court-martial." He meant it. Men said nothing. They stared at the fire. Some looked away. Others watched until the last ember collapsed into ash. Raymond felt something settle in his chest, heavy, cold. Not fear. Finality. That night, the perimeter felt different, quieter, but not safer. 2 days later, the jungle answered. Private George Martinez was filling his canteens at the water point just after dawn when the shot hit him. It came from distance, clean, familiar. He fell without a word. By the time medics reached him, it was over. The scout vanished the way they always did. Raymond stood over the body and felt the weight of the decision crash into him. Martinez had been using a platform rifle before the inspection. Thornton's order had taken it away. The line between cause and effect wasn't theoretical anymore. That night, Raymond rebuilt. He didn't hide the work. He didn't pretend it was temporary. He attached the platform and left it there. 3 other soldiers did the same. Sergeant Miller found out at first light. He pulled Raymond aside, voice low and urgent. "If the captain sees this, you're done," he said. "Court-martial. Discharge. Maybe Leavenworth." Raymond didn't argue. "Martinez is dead," he said. He wouldn't be if this was still allowed. Miller stared at him for a long moment. Then he looked away. "Keep it hidden during inspections," he said finally. "I'll do what I can." The underground returned. Platforms were rebuilt at night and removed by day. Rifles complied with regulations on paper and broke them in practice. Men learned how to mount and dismount the platforms quickly, like muscle memory. Thornton never found another one. Or if he did, he chose not to see it. Casualties stabilized again. Scouts hesitated. The numbers drifted back toward what they had been before the burn pit. The difference was impossible to ignore now. Paper said the platforms didn't exist. Reality said they worked. Somewhere higher up the chain, someone noticed the contradiction. Not a captain. Not a major. Someone who read reports and saw patterns instead of rules. Because when order conflicts with survival long enough, one of them eventually breaks. And this time, it wouldn't be the men on the line. The burn pit. Nothing looked different on paper. Rifles were listed as standard. Inspections showed compliance. Reports checked the right boxes. But at night, the platforms came back. Quietly. Carefully. Built from new scrap. Mounted when it mattered. Removed when it didn't. Men learned to work in reverse. Assemble in darkness. Disassemble by dawn. It became routine, the kind of routine soldiers develop when survival depends on memory instead of permission. The effect returned just as quietly. Scouts hesitated again. Approaches slowed. Distances stretched. And the casualty numbers shifted. At first, it was small enough to ignore. A week with fewer scout-related injuries. Then another. Then a pattern that refused to flatten. Before the platforms, Company K averaged more than 4 scout-related casualties a week, killed and wounded combined. The deaths came singly, unpredictably, from distances no one could answer. After the platforms reappeared underground, that number dropped by more than half. No announcement followed. No congratulations. But someone noticed. Not a field officer. Not a man with mud on his boots. Someone farther back where maps replaced foxholes and trends mattered more than stories. Across the regiment, the same pattern appeared. Units with higher adoption of the platforms, officially non-existent, showed fewer long-range scout casualties. Units without them didn't. It wasn't dramatic. It was statistical. And statistics don't argue. They wait. By January 1944, the anomaly was impossible to dismiss. One regiment was bleeding less than the others in the same terrain, against the same enemy, using the same doctrine. A small investigative team arrived without ceremony. No speeches, no threats, just questions. Sergeant Miller showed them the difference not with rhetoric, but with demonstration. A standard Springfield fired from kneeling, then from prone. The wobble was obvious. Then the same rifle with the platform mounted. The sight settled. The investigators didn't smile. They didn't nod. They took notes. They compared patrol logs, casualty reports, after-action summaries. They marked dates before adoption, after the burn pit, after the underground rebuild. The trend held. Lives weren't being saved by luck. They were being saved by stability. One of the officers finally asked the question that mattered. "Who built these?" Miller didn't answer right away. Then he pointed. Raymond stood a few yards away, cleaning his rifle the way he always did, slow, methodical, as if nothing about the moment mattered. The officer approached him. "Did you design this?" "Yes, sir." "Where did the idea come from?" Raymond hesitated only long enough to choose honesty. "My grandfather," he said. "He used something like it for hunting. It keeps the rifle steady." The officer turned the platform over in his hands. "It's crude," he said. "Yes, sir. But it works." Raymond didn't respond. He didn't need to. The numbers already had. The team left without giving orders or promises. But the message traveled faster than they did. The platforms weren't going away this time, because when paperwork and casualty charts collide, one of them always yields. And the Army had finally been forced to see what the jungle had known for months. You can't regulate gravity. You can't discipline physics. If a solution keeps men alive long enough to change enemy behavior, it stops being unauthorized. It becomes inevitable. Approval didn't arrive with fanfare. It came the way most decisions do in war, quietly, delayed, and wrapped in language that made it sound inevitable. A report moved up the chain. Then another. The language shifted from unauthorized modification to field-developed solution. Recommendations replaced warnings. Questions turned into procedures. By spring of 1944, instructions were circulating through the Pacific Theater. Designated marksmen were authorized to use a forward stability platform. Construction guidelines were provided. Improvements were suggested: stronger materials, standardized dimensions, better attachment points. The Army hadn't admitted it was wrong. It had simply changed the rules. Supply sergeants received specifications. Workshops began producing cleaner versions of the same ugly idea. Less splintered wood, better fitted supports, metal where wire had once been twisted by hand. The platform became official. Raymond watched the process from a distance. No one asked him for input. No one thanked him. The paperwork described the innovation as a collective field adaptation, a response to tactical conditions, a natural evolution of doctrine. Names didn't appear in those paragraphs. By summer, hundreds of rifles across the theater carried versions of the platform. By the end of the war, thousands did. Japanese intelligence reports began referencing American marksmen as a distinct threat at extended range. The modification had changed behavior. It had saved lives, and it belonged to no one. Raymond didn't protest. He didn't file a complaint. He didn't try to explain what had happened in a foxhole with a flashlight and a heated nail. He understood something most soldiers learned early. Wars don't reward solutions. They absorb them. Credit moves upward. Blame moves downward. Results disappear into doctrine. Raymond stayed where he was, doing what he'd always done: cleaning rifles, standing watch, letting gravity do its work. The platform he'd built originally remained with him, battered and scarred, hidden among newer, cleaner versions that owed their existence to it. When the war ended, he packed his gear and went home. There were no medals for unauthorized ideas, no ceremonies for tools built in secret. Raymond returned to Iowa and took over the same farm his grandfather had worked. He married, he raised children, he spent decades fixing what broke, building what was needed, and ignoring anything that didn't earn its place. The original rifle hung above his workbench. Sometimes he used it for groundhogs. It still worked. Years later, a historian would track him down and ask about the platform, about its origin, its spread, its impact. Raymond answered politely and briefly. When asked if it bothered him that the Army never credited him, he paused. Then he shook his head. Recognition wouldn't have changed the outcome, he said. The men who lived mattered more than the name on the paperwork. The platform had done what it was meant to do. It kept rifles steady. It kept friends alive. Everything else was just documentation. Vandermeer never thought of what he built as an innovation. To him, it was just a fix. When something doesn't work on a farm, you don't write a report about it. You don't wait for permission. You don't debate theory. You fix it, because crops don't care why a solution failed. They only care that it did. That mindset followed him home. After the war, Raymond returned to Iowa and took over the same stretch of land his grandfather had worked before him. The world moved on. Tractors improved. Crops rotated. Seasons came and went. The war rarely came up. When it did, Raymond answered the way many infantrymen did: briefly, vaguely, and without drama. He'd been in the Pacific. He'd been infantry. Then he'd changed the subject. The rifle came home with him. Not the factory versions. Not the standardized platform that now appeared in manuals and photographs. The original one, the ugly plank, the bent supports, the tool built at night by flashlight and stubbornness. It hung above his workbench. Sometimes he used it for groundhogs. Sometimes he didn't. It was never displayed like a trophy. It was stored like a tool because that's what it had always been. Years later, a military historian tracked Raymond down. The historian had followed the paperwork backward: reports, evaluations, doctrine changes and discovered a gap. A solution had appeared fully formed in the system, but its origin had been erased. Someone had built it first. Raymond agreed to speak, but only once. He explained the platform the same way he'd always understood it, not as a breakthrough, not as an act of rebellion, but as common sense. Rifles needed to stay still. The jungle didn't allow that. So he changed the way the rifle rested. The historian asked how many lives the modification had saved. Raymond didn't know. He didn't care to calculate it. Numbers were for people far from the field. When the historian told him conservative estimates placed the figure in the hundreds, Raymond shrugged. Then came the question people always ask when they assume recognition is the point. Did it bother him that the army never credited him? Raymond took longer to answer that one. He said no. Not because he was humble in the cinematic sense. Not because he thought recognition was meaningless. But because he understood something that rarely survives peacetime. Recognition doesn't stop bullets. In war, solutions matter only insofar as they arrive in time. It doesn't matter who gets credit if the fix shows up after the body bags are filled. The platform mattered because it worked when it was needed, not because it looked good on paper. That's the part most histories struggle with. Wars are remembered through generals and strategies and equipment lists, but wars are actually won through small decisions made under pressure by people with no authority to make them. A private who refuses to accept that the rules are more important than the men standing next to him. A sergeant who looks the other way. An officer who notices numbers instead of defending pride. The platform didn't change the war by itself. It changed something smaller but more important. It changed who controlled distance. And distance, in war, decides everything. The Japanese scouts had dominated the long-range fight not because they were braver or better trained, but because their assumptions were correct. They believed Americans couldn't hit them at certain ranges. Once that assumption died, so did their advantage. That shift didn't come from a laboratory. It didn't come from a committee. It came from a foxhole. That's the uncomfortable truth most institutions learn too slowly. Systems are designed to preserve order. Battlefields demand results. When those two collide, someone always pays the price for the delay. Raymond understood that instinctively. Because he had grown up somewhere, consequences were immediate. Crops fail. Engines break. Animals destroy what you don't protect. You don't argue with reality. You adapt to it. The army eventually did the same. It authorized the platform. It improved it. It absorbed it into doctrine. And in doing so, it erased the circumstances that forced it into existence. That erasure wasn't malicious. It was procedural. The system had corrected itself and moved on. Raymond lived the rest of his life quietly. He worked the land. He raised a family. Fixed what broke and replaced what couldn't be fixed. When he died, his obituary mentioned his service. It mentioned his farm. It mentioned his family. It didn't mention the rifle. The platform passed to his grandson, where it still rests wood-scarred, metal-dulled, utterly unimpressive to anyone who doesn't know what it did. And that feels appropriate, because the real lesson of the hay rack rifle isn't about weapons. It's about initiative. War doesn't wait for authorization. It doesn't pause for consensus. Men die while paperwork circulates. The people who change outcomes aren't always the ones with rank. They're the ones who recognize a problem, understand it deeply enough to solve it, and act before permission arrives. Sometimes, that's all it takes. One person, one ugly idea, one decision to act when the system says no. Everything else, the manuals, the approvals, the doctrine, comes later.